You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We are thrilled to be bringing you an interview with retired FBI Special Agent Bobby Chacon to give us all sorts of interesting tales from life as an FBI agent in New York City. Bobby, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Can you go ahead and start by giving our listeners a quick thumbnail sketch about your background, especially educational background and your time with the FBI?
Sure. I was the very typical suburban kid in New York City. Parents who moved out to the Long Island when they had kids and raised us in a very suburban middle class upbringing. My father was a cop, NYPD. My mom was a nurse. Very common coupling. They had 4 kids. My brother became an NYPD detective. And we all went to college. I went to Georgia Tech for nuclear engineering on a Navy ROTC scholarship. And then I ultimately got my business degree at University of South Florida, and then decided to go back up to New York, my home, and went to law school at Hofstra University School of Law, where I was recruited. There was a recruitment day there, like many career days everybody's been to, and the FBI had a booth, and I was interested because I was drawn to law enforcement, having a father and by then a brother already in law enforcement. And so I had actually applied and taken the test for the NYPD. And even though I knew I was going to be a lawyer, but I wanted to be a cop, my brother had this sergeant that was a cop by day and a lawyer by night. So he supplemented his income from the police department by hanging a shingle at night and doing real estate closings and wills and estates and trusts and some divorce work. And so I figured do that until I retired, got my pension at 42 years old, and then hang out my own shingle. But instead, the FBI called after some soul searching and talking to my dad. He recommended I go with the feds. And in 1987, I attended Quantico. I went to Quantico and I was assigned right back up to New York City, which was the only office in the FBI at the time that you could go back to if you came from there. Because the FBI typically does not send you back home, at least initially. You have to work somewhere else. And there's a variety of reasons they do that. New York, because New York had such a high cost of living and we were on very entry-level government salaries, that they were getting a lot of agents that were from different parts of the country and just couldn't do a 3-hour commute into New York City because that's how far they had to go out to afford a place to live that the wife was happy with and the kids were in a good school district. All that stuff that young people that are starting families need. And so they were getting a lot of agents quitting and things like that. So they said, if you're from New York and want to go right back, we'll let you do that. They ultimately also started giving financial incentives to people in higher cost of living areas like San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles. So I started in New York in 1987, and I was assigned initially to a organized crime squad working the Mafia, the Lucchese crime family in particular. The way the FBI works organized crime in New York is that there is an entire FBI squad dedicated to each of the 5 Mafia ruling families.
Oh, wow.
So we were dedicated, our whole squad, 17, probably close to 20 people. There was probably about half and half special agents and NYPD detectives. So it was a task force. The 17 to 20 of us were fully concentrated on the Lucchese crime family, which is, if you saw the movie Goodfellas, Paul Sorvino's character was Paul Barrio. That was the head of our family. Henry Hill, who was played by Ray Liotta in that movie, was an informant on my squad. And that was our family. So remember, they did the Lufthansa heist at Kennedy Airport and things like that.
Right.
In the movie, the Lucchese family, one of their specialties was they controlled the cargo moving in and out of Kennedy Airport, much like the Gambino family and Gotti and Sammy the Bull controlled a lot of the concrete things. So each family had a different racket. And the Lucchese family's racket was the cargo at Kennedy Airport. Now, they shared with other families. There was the ruling commission made sure that everything was fair and divvied up and stuff. So I mainly worked cargo thefts at Kennedy Airport and the Lucchese crime family.
I think it's so nice that the 5 families were able to divvy things up so that it was fair to the various criminal families.
Yeah, they really operated as a conglomerate. It was really amazing. my typical day on a squad like that, if you weren't taking your turn in what we call the wire room, which was meant to sat there reading a magazine and having headphones on and listening to wiretaps, because we would have microphones in their offices, we'd have microphones in their homes, in their cars sometimes, and then we might be up on their phone at the time. And so you would have to spend your time doing that, which was basically going to what we call a trap, and you'd sit there and you'd try to not die from boredom. On the other hand, if you weren't doing that day, you were probably in a car surveilling the people that the other guys are listening to. So we had eyes on and ears on, so you get the full picture.
And this is a pre-cell phone environment. So that's right. This is landlines and
right. Pagers came into play.
Oh, that's right. Pagers. Yeah.
Yeah. So they'd get a page with a code, and then you'd hear them in the car, pull over, I got to find a phone. And then hopefully they were calling back to a number what we were already on or something like that. But so you were either doing surveillance, or you were doing sitting the wire, listening, or you're doing your own investigation. Like when a whole slew of numbers comes in, we don't know who these numbers are, they're calling, then we would issue a subpoena to the phone company for the subscribers of those numbers, and we would start to get the subscribers in, and you'd sit at your desk and literally by hand, you'd go through. Now it's all done by disk. It's all done. You'd get a thumb drive. But I would get inches and inches of phone records, and I have a ruler, and I would go line by line, the phone number called, the time it was called, the duration of the call. It didn't seem tedious at the time. It seemed really interesting as a young FBI agent. But now I don't know that the agents now could do that, because now they put a thumb drive in a computer. It downloads all that information. It analyzes it, and it tells them this number's called every Tuesday at 5:00. That's a number you might want to look at. I had to write that on an index card and look for it myself and notice those connections myself. Going, oh my God, it looks like every Tuesday they call the same number.
But now the software would look for patterns like that.
Yeah, it's called PenLink, I remember, is one of the first ones to come along, because the pen register is the device that kind of records all those. So PenLink was a software program that would download that information and immediately give you patterns and recurring behaviors and recurring numbers on certain days and time. The amount of work it took me to do that kind of analysis was weeks and months, and now they were doing it instantaneously. This was after I left.
For our younger listeners, Bobby, seriously, because we run into this when we talk to folks, explain what a pager is and what it does, because that's old school.
Yeah.
Kristin's a young lass, but she's old enough, I think, to remember.
A pager was a device that's about half the size of a pack of cigarettes. Think of that as a general size of it. Maybe half the size of a pack of cigarettes. And it had a clip on it, and it linked to your belt. And it had a small linear top that had a little window on it, just the top of the device. That printout, that little window would give you numbers. And if I wanted you to call me back, I would page you to my number. And you'd see my number come up. You either knew the number or you didn't. You recognized it or you didn't. And you would call the number. You would find a phone, normally in the city, a pay phone, and you'd literally get out. Either it was a booth or it was sometimes just on a wall, and you'd have to have coins, and you'd put the coins in the machine, and it would allow you to make a phone call for a certain amount of time. Because if it was going over, you'd have to put more coins in. It would warn you. It was about to hang up on you if you didn't put more coins in the machine. And so the pages, there was some enterprising people that could use the numbers in a way that spelled a word, little things like that. Or if you really wanted somebody to call you back, because you'd put your number in and then put 911, like that's an emergency page. And so, little tricks like that. This was a device that could not communicate. You couldn't return it. It wasn't a two-way device. You only got incoming information. You got a number that somebody, and it didn't have to be a full phone number. If you knew codes, they might send you 4 digits. Or whatever. And if you had a code language set up, you would know what those 4 digits meant. But it was only numeric digits. And it was about, I think the maximum was about 12 characters. And it was only incoming information. You would then take that and find a phone or take an action based on whatever those digits were that you were understanding. We didn't have cell phones, and really pagers had just come into being. Right. And then, of course, the pages got more sophisticated in pre-cell phones, and then all of a sudden, cell phones and car phones came in. And the first car phones we had were bricks. They were big, and they were attached to the car.
I remember those.
They were really big, and they had a stubby antenna, this big rubber stubby antenna on it. Yeah, the evolution of the cell phone, it was quite interesting. But then that's the way we were working back then. This was 87, 88, 89. Not that long ago to me.
No, I know. It's funny because we laugh about this because Kristin and I speak to college audiences and so on. And I'll make these references and I'll understand that people have no idea what we're talking about, even though it's only 30 years ago. And then people will ask us questions based on the technology that they grew up with. So, for instance, people will often ask us about, like, the Colonial Parkway murders. They'll ask us, well, was there surveillance video available? And that was an extremely rare thing 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah,
and,
very rare.
And, for example, the idea that someone would call 911 on their cell phone, again, there is no opportunity to use a cell phone. Now, here's a question for you, and we'll see if you can reveal a secret here or not 30 years later. Did the FBI have the technology that would allow them to intercept or see what was being transmitted to a pager?
No, we didn't have. I would qualify this. No, we didn't. But the FBI was bifurcated, and you might have, if you read the 9/11 Reporter, when I'm actually going to discuss a project with you that I'm doing on 9/11 in a little while, but the FBI was divided. In New York, the New York FBI office, it was the 25th floor. The guys that were working counter-espionage, that is in New York City, the Russian embassy to the UN, the Chinese consulate, all the UN missions and stuff. So we had a whole cadre of agents that worked nothing but that stuff. And they could use stuff that we weren't allowed to know about. So those were the secret squirrel guys, we called them. And my badge, actually, we had 7 floors in the federal building, and I could get in 6 of the 7 floors, but I couldn't get on the 25th floor. They could get on all of the floors, but what we call the criminal agents, could not access there. And they had the most sophisticated electronic stuff available. And a lot of it was made by the FBI's ERF, the Engineering Research Facility at Quantico. We have our own engineers that come up with this stuff that subformally work for tech companies and stuff. The reason we couldn't know about that stuff, we got to find out and use this stuff about 10 years later, because it was national security that they were working, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans. And remember, this is still right at the end of the Cold War. Anything that I used, if I put a wiretap on the Lucchese family, if I used a camera to take the pictures, all of that has to be turned over in federal court in what we call the discovery process. You have to turn everything over to the defense. The foreign counterintelligence guys who are working national security matters really could not afford to turn things over. They couldn't afford to let us use these super cameras or the super technology that they were using to catch Russian spies, because then the Russians would find out about it. Because then one of us, if we arrested somebody using that technology, we'd have to divulge it in court, in open court. And so I will say that we didn't have the technology at the time to do what you said, to intercept information going to a pager. I can't say whether or not all foreign counterintelligence guys had that, because I don't know, because we would, again, there was like a 6, 8, 10-year lag when they were done with it, or when the Russians already knew about that technology, or the Chinese had developed their own version of it, then, it would be obsolete. They would be on to the next thing, and they'd pass that technology down to us.
The lowly criminal guys.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that was that. So I will say that, not to my knowledge, while I was working them, did we have the ability to intercept those kind of communications.
Now, do you know what the origin was? It's an interesting strategy to actually structure the New York FBI office by criminal family. That was something that was always done, so you became a specialist.
If you know the history of the FBI, Mr. Hoover did not even admit there was a mafia for a very long time. And then there was a famous meeting that's now known in organized crime world as the Appalachian meeting. It was upstate New York. It was a state trooper that happened to up upon this farmhouse that had all these cars parked in front of it. And he said that was his beat, and he never saw that many cars there. It was one of the uncles of one of the bosses in New York, and they needed a place to meet in an emergency. And they all drove a couple of hours north of the city to this very remote farmhouse. And the trooper just stumbled upon it. He took all these license plates down. Somehow that got down to New York City, to the detectives that work, these guys in New York City, got over to the FBI. And then there was a kind of a roundup at that house. They went in and they talked things. And that was the first time all these guys went together in one spot and forced Mr. Hoover to recognize that there was an organized crime structure, an Italian mafia in existence in New York. I'm not sure that he believed there was none, or he just didn't want to admit it, or what the background of that was. But that was in 1959, I believe, was the Appalachian meeting. But it was not until the early 60s. Remember, Bobby Kennedy was the attorney general, and he really started the war against the mafia and their infiltration of organized labor and the Teamsters unions and things like that. And so the FBI, by virtue of serving the attorney general, was pretty much forced then to start beefing up our efforts towards the Mafia. And every other city in America has one ruling family. And there's the Scarpos in Philadelphia, the Trafficante in Tampa. Everybody has their one boss. And New York was special because it had the 5 families and they had the commission. The bosses of the 5 families formed the commission. And this slowly came out as we dedicated more manpower to it. That's what happened. The need was, I think at first was a squad would handle 2 and another squad would handle 3. But these families were so big and they were just so much that very early on in that effort, it was decided we need a dedicated squad to each family. And when I first got there, it was amazing because as a young FBI agent, it was so interesting. There was a big board. Every squad area had a big board with the family on it. Here's who's the current acting boss, who's the underboss, who's the consigliere, right? That's the advisor to the boss and the underboss. And then who are the capos? So the capos all had several crews under them. And so you go down the line and you could just see it. And we had flashcards with the different guys. We had guys working them for years, 20, 30 years, and they knew everybody's uncle and everybody's cousin and who married who and who's not getting along with who. And it was really an interesting time. Now, I was there just around the time that Omerta fell. So Omerta was the code of silence, that you take everything to your death, that you go to jail for life, if that be to protect the business and protect the family. Omerta was the code of silence that the Mafia took. Of course, that has now broken apart. That was obliterated in the late 80s, just after actually I moved on from the Mafia over to drugs and what we call non-traditional organized crime, which were the Jamaican posses and the Chinese triad gangs and things like that. Once I moved over there, then Sammy the Bull of the Gambino family, he came over and was a witness. And so all Pete Chiodo for our family, for the fat Pete Chiodo, who was shot like 8 times, filling his car with gas and survived because he was 400 pounds. And they were pulling 8 bullets out of the subcutaneous fat. And I remember guarding him in the hospital, and him and his son, who was 350 pounds, would order 8 pizzas. And they would eat 8. These 2 guys would eat 8 pizzas for dinner. It was just amazing. But then you started having these guys start to flip, and high-level guys. Sammy the Bull was the most famous and was an underboss and was probably one of the highest-ranking guys ever to defect over. Yeah, but it was the FBI's pressure on them. And when we broke some of those top guys, then everybody else felt it was okay to save their own hides and make a deal with the government and spend a lot less time in jail and cooperate.
Mm-hmm. The commission that you referenced, what purpose did this commission of the 5 families serve? What were they trying to do by having this?
Well, on a basic form, it was so everybody plays nice. So I mentioned earlier that the Lucchese family might have had the cargo operations at Kennedy Airport. If the Gambino family somehow has a truck guy that comes to them because he's a cousin of somebody in the Gambino family and says, hey, they got me hauling these televisions or refrigerators every Thursday. I could give you guys a truck. Just come and hit me in the face and hold me up and I can give you the truck, and the company gets insurance and you get a truckload of TVs or whatever. And so if the Gambinos have that, instead of like them doing it on the sly, the commission hears it and says, hey, we've got this guy. We're going to take every 2 weeks, we're going to take a truckload of TVs, and it's going to be worth X thousands of dollars. And it's the Gambino family, but they'll kick back some of that money to the Lucchese family because they have the cargo at Kennedy Airport. So the commission was there to make sure people played fair and that everybody got their share of stuff. And if there was something citywide, because sometimes the families were geographically located, that was citywide and somebody got a scam going that was making a lot of money, the commission would decide you have to kick back some money to the family that basically that's their area. And so the commission was there to make sure that the interactions and the business between the 5 families ran smoothly. It didn't always, and I remember war erupted between the Colombos and the Genovese for a couple of years while I was there, and there was an internal war between those 2 families. The other 3 families stood back, didn't get involved, and they were killing each other, and they went to the mattresses, right? That was when these guys it's such a war is on, they couldn't go home because they were afraid for their own family, so they would get a warehouse somewhere, and they would literally line the floor with mattresses, and they would just sleep on the mattresses, and that's where they would live because they would all guard each other while the war was going on. That's called going to the mattresses, because you're not going to be home for weeks or months at a time because the war is going on. And so the commission was there to coordinate and to dispute resolution if there was a beef between 2 families. If you remember the movie Goodfellas, the Joe Pesci character beats to death a guy, Billy Batts, in the bar one day. He had just gotten out of jail, and he beat him to death and because he had insulted Joe Pesci's character. It turns out that guy was a made guy. A made guy is a guy who's been indoctrinated into one of the 5 families. They get cut. There's a ceremony. It's very gothic. There's a whole thing that happens. And when you're made into the family, it's a really big deal. And so you can't take action against another made guy, especially like in that movie, Joe Pesci's character wasn't a made guy yet. He was trying to be. He was trying to earn his way into the family. And he killed a guy that was turned out to be a made guy. That's a no in the office. So the commission gets together and they sanction Joe Pesci's murder. And his family, the family that he works with and is going to supposedly guard him, has to stand back because the commission has now said he violated all rules. He killed a made guy. If you have a beef with a made guy, you have to elevate the beef up your line and the bosses work it out. And he didn't do that. He killed that guy. And so that's another thing the commission does. And in that movie, which was based on a real story, the commission sanctioned the hit. And then you remember Robert De Niro's character gets the call at the diner and says he's gone. There's nothing we can do about it. It was a done deal. And so he slams the phone down. And they're broken up because they now know their friend was murdered, but it was a sanctioned murder by the commission that said everybody else hands off. This is a payback for a violation of the rules.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
How long did it take you to really get a handle on all of this? The rules, the relationships, all of this. This sounds incredibly complicated. How long did it take you till you felt comfortable knowing all of it?
As complicated as it sounds, the fact that it's so organized makes it easier. It's like going now and reading the corporate structure of Apple or a tech company. Okay, this working group does this, group of people does that, and and they were so organized that it actually helped you understand it really quick. But I would say within 6 months of me being there, and every day, this is your job, so you're doing it. Young agents tend to spend more time at the office because they're single and they're totally into it. And I was spending 14, 16 hours a day at the office and then taking it home, taking files home and just reading it home. It's like reading a Mafia book, except it's real. And the next day you might be following those people around. So there was a lot of interest, a lot of enthusiasm. And with that level of interest and enthusiasm, it doesn't take you that long. It probably took me, I would say, 4 to 6 months to really get to know the family. Now, it's always changing because people are going to jail, people are dying, new people are being recruited in. So I won't say I had a handle on everybody's relationship, like the guys that were there for 20 years, but the basic structure of what they were doing and how they were doing it, it took about 4 to 6 months to figure that out.
Do you reach a place where you can actually recognize some of the voices on the wiretap?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Everybody, that's one of the things you really develop when you listen to so many phone calls. 2 things happen. First of all, your own sense of privacy goes out the window. I've never felt comfortable talking on the phone since. And you do develop, everybody has a different cadence to their speech and everybody has a different personal vernacular that they use and things. And it was not very difficult to start listening because I would, in the office, so sometimes you're listening to tapes when you're in the wire room, but the next day you might have a reel-to-reel. We had reel-to-reels on our desk back then. And you'd get these reels and you'd listen to a phone call that somebody looked at and said, hey, this should be looked at closer because we think they're talking about this. So then the next day, and if I was there listening to that, I needed more expertise, I'd call over one of the old timers and say, here, listen to this. Who is this? And he would go, he'd listen for a minute. He goes, that's Joey Bag of Donuts. And then you write that down. That's Joe who it was. And I wouldn't know that voice. I know that guy's voice if I heard 3 calls in a row, but I wouldn't know who it was. But the old timers would know who it was. And then you just make a note of it and stuff. But you do get to learn their voices. You get to learn their families. Because remember, if we're up in their house, we would hear their kids, we would hear their wife, everybody.
Knowing that you at the FBI were using those techniques, what were the workarounds that the families would use to try to avoid you listening in on their conversations?
John Gotti made the walk and talk famous, right? So the Ravenite Social Club that Gotti was based out of in Queens, you often see those famous pictures of him walking up and down the sidewalk. So that's what he would do, walk and talk. They figure as long as they were walking outside, there was enough ambient noise that would cover them. And they would have these crude, because they're not very bright guys, they would have these crude kind of codes that we would figure out right away, or an informant would tell us what it was. If we could hear what they were saying, even if they were talking in code, we'd know what they were doing. But they would try to walk. They would try to walk on a city street, and all the noise of the traffic and things like that, they knew that would hopefully hide what they said. Sometimes they would turn the TV up. Above the Ravenite Social Club was a little old lady that had lived there for decades. And Gotti would sometimes use her apartment if she was out for little meetings and stuff like that. So when we finally broke the case, we were able to get into her apartment and set bugs up there. And we actually put a camera in her television. And that's some of the stuff that put Gotti away, or some of the stuff that convinced Sammy to cooperate, was stuff from that little old lady's apartment above the social club. But our black bag team got in there, and those guys go in at night. Those guys are really special, and they break in and they set all that stuff up. They find ways to power it without batteries. They wire into the apartment and things like that. Those guys were electricians. They were carpenters. They were locksmiths, and they were FBI agents, and they had all that expertise. And they would go in and do that stuff, and you'd never know they were there, even in your own house. They wouldn't even leave a fork out of place on a dining room table when they were in and out.
Wow. You spent some time as an undercover agent. What would you say are the attributes that you possess that made you an exceptional undercover agent?
Here's the thing. Undercover agents, first of all, you need to have a lot of confidence. You need to have a calm demeanor. With that, you have to be comfortable in that situation, and not everybody's comfortable in every situation. So like, I grew up in an Italian-American family. I grew up with a lot of kids. My friends were Italians and stuff. So I could do that. So I could be in that world, and I could be comfortable in that world. I couldn't say I was going to be undercover in the Jamaican organized crime world. That I later, when I moved over there, I had my own undercovers. One FBI agent I used all the time was born and raised in Jamaica. Came to this country, got his citizenship, and became an FBI agent. But he was born and raised in Jamaica. So he could do that. So I would say that even good undercovers, nobody's universal. Nobody can do everything like the movie show. You can't be undercover against the Italian Mafia one day and against the Chinese triads the next day. It just doesn't work that way. I did have a friend, Jack Garcia, who went by the name of Jack Falcone, undercover, and he has a book called The Making of Jack Falcone. He played a mafia hitman, and he was good at it because he was 350 pounds. Nobody thought he was going to be an FBI agent. And he would play the role of, as a hitman, he would get hired by the Irish gangs, or he worked for the Italians or the Spanish. He could do different things for different people because of the role he was playing. But no one's going to infiltrate the Chinese triads unless they're Chinese. No one's going to infiltrate the Jamaican posses unless they're Jamaican. It's a cultural thing. But I was working Italians. I came from an Italian-American family. It was very easy for me to do what we call cameo roles. And that was if you had a main undercover and you need people to play cameo roles, just like you would think a movie. So I would go in and play his buddy or play his cousin or whatever, because the more details you can fill in for an undercover, the better and richer their background is, the more people are going to be comfortable with them. So like, I've known you 2 years. I've never met any of your family. See, that kind of thing. So if you need me to kind of, is the cousin that's passing through or whatever. And so I did some of that. I drove a truck at Kennedy Airport because that's what the Lucchese's were doing. They had the two Teamster locals corrupted. And so they would be they would have no-show jobs. They would allow the trucking companies to bid on contracts that would probably require 10 new drivers. They weren't going to be paying salaries and the health and welfare benefits for 10 new Teamster drivers. So they would negotiate with the Teamsters and say, we're going to have this contract. We're going to hire 10 new drivers. We'll put 6 of them on the union rolls. We'll hire 4 of them non-union. So we don't have to pay health and benefits, health and welfare. And the union says, all right, no, 7 and 3, and then give us a no-show job. So then the contract would include a job for Sammy the Bull, and he'd be on the contract, and he'd be an employee of that company collecting a paycheck, never showed up. Never. And the paycheck would go to a post office box or picked up at the union hall every week or whatever. And so there was a lot of shenanigans like that going on. So I could drive a truck and I could go into the union hall. And I could listen in and on conversations and just be hanging around. And you just have to be calm and confident. Those are the two things. And if you know your business. Now, I wasn't in the one thing about the Mafia that they have a code of business. They didn't kill police officers. Although when I was there, Everett Hatcher, a DEA agent, was murdered by an Italian Mafia guy, but he was rogue. And we spent 18 months trying to track him down, Gus Ferracci. And they were hunting him at the same time we were. The Mafia wanted him dead because he broke the rules. We were chasing him because we wanted him in jail for killing Everett Hatcher. They got to him first. 18 months later, he was dead on the street in Queens, down the block from his mother's house. They were doing the same thing we were doing. They were staking out places they thought he might be. So they had an operation going the same time we were, and we knew that. We knew we had to get to him before they did, and they got him first, and they killed him.
Would something be said then between the crime family and law enforcement that...
Yeah, what we did was whenever it was killed, we did what was called a bumper lock operation, and we shut down every gambling hall, every prostitution house, every loan sharking operation they had going. And that is very manpower intensive. So we borrowed people that were working white collar crime and other things. And we literally followed every capo, every boss, certainly every underboss, every consigliere, every capo, and almost every associate 24/7. Literally, we call it a bumper lock operation, which means you're not trying to hide. So me and my partner would drive to Staten Island. We were assigned this one particular capo. We'd park in front of his house. And when he came out in the morning, we go, hey, Benny. He'd go, hey, agents. And we would literally follow him every minute of the day. And then we would hand him off to a night crew or something. And so they couldn't breathe. They couldn't do any of their operations. They couldn't do anything. you can't keep this up for very long for us because it's super manpower intensive. But for them, it shut down their sources of revenue for a period of time. They couldn't tolerate that. They knew as soon as we caught Gus or they killed Gus, that the pressure would have to be released a little bit, at least that they were counting on. And quite frankly, it had to, because we couldn't keep that. You can't keep that up. It's too manpower intensive. So the government just doesn't have enough money to do that and stuff. And so we had that bumper lock operation going. And that's why they were chasing him as well, because they knew if they could get him and kill him, number one, he couldn't talk. He couldn't make a deal. And number two, the pressure of the bumper lock operation will probably be lifted.
Would a high-level FBI officer ever speak to the special agent in charge or squad leaders with the FBI? In other words, did the captains of the two teams ever speak on or off the record?
We would talk to the street level guys, actually. The FBI has a very shallow organizational structure. The street agent really has all the power. Everybody above the street agent really is there to support them. For example, I remember an old time taking me out. I wasn't there a few months, and we went and talked to the boss of the family, Little Vic Amusa, and Anthony Gaspipe Queso, and he was the underboss. And what happened was the FBI was we had a rule that said if we got what we thought was credible information of a threat to somebody's life, we had to go tell them, because if something happened on another family's wiretap that they heard that there may be a hit on our boss. So they let us know that information. Now we got to go tell him. We got to make an official notification. So me and this guy go up, and we get out, and we're out of our government car, and we're in our suits, and we start walking up to this handball court, because we knew where the boss was. Every morning, 9:30, he's at the handball court in Queens. He's playing handball with his guys. He's in his velour jumpsuit, right, sweatsuit, and
just like Goodfellas.
Yeah, and we walk up, and he's, "Hey, agents, good morning. How you doing?" Some of the lower level guys get grumpy and stuff, but the boss, they know it's all business. And so he shakes our hands, and he says, "What can I do for you?" And he says, "We have to notify you that we're in receipt of information that there could be a credible threat on your life." And he said, "Oh, that's funny, because I'm a nobody. I work in a plumbing supply store. I'm a salesman. I don't know why anybody would want to kill me, but thanks for letting me know." "Yeah, whatever. Yeah, but don't worry about it. No problem. Just so you know, we're going to fill out a report saying you've been advised." He goes, yeah, I'll let everybody know. I'll let you know. I won't deny it. You told me. Thank you very much. And he goes, "I'm dumbfounded." When we walked away, a little chuckle and stuff. And so we fulfilled our obligation. But like I was in the office maybe 5-6 months, and I'm talking to the head of the family. This guy's picture that's at the top of that board in the squad area. We made the official notification. We went back. We put a notice in the file. We told him there was a threat on his life. Now, immediately, I'm sure that calm demeanor of his, he was probably cursing up a storm. He got back to his social club and said, "Those MFers, I'm going to find out who." They probably had a full operation to find out what that was. They knew damn well we were on a wiretap on somebody, and we heard it. They knew that. They know that stuff. And so I'm sure that riled him, but he wasn't going to let us see that. And so,
after all, he was in the plumbing supply business.
Yeah, that's all he does. Yeah, but he knew all of us. He didn't know my boss or the head of the office unless he saw him on TV. But he knew, certainly didn't know my name, but he knew John's name, that I went with Agent Cap. And he may have even arrested him previously. I don't know. Those guys that were there for a long time, they had relationships, but it was generally the street level agents. They knew the bosses, the capos, and the associates all by name, and so did the bad guys know us by name.
Now, I know another big part of your career was a focus on counterterrorism, and of course that started as a result of the 9/11 attacks. Can you give us your 9/11 story? I have heard it before, and it is fascinating.
Sure. In 2001, I was still assigned to the New York office. I had been there I got there in 87, so I've been there about 14 years. I was running the FBI dive team. I was the only full-time diver in the FBI at the time, and the New York team was the only one in existence at the time. So about a month prior to 9/11, I got a call from the Michigan State Police, and their dive team had a little trouble on a dive, and they asked us if we would go to Lake Michigan, up at a place called Traverse City, Michigan, and do a dive for a murder weapon there. So I flew out, as was our practice, and I did a site survey of the area, talked to the local dive team, see what they had done and stuff, and so what we could do. Went back to New York, got my manpower together, did some planning, what it was going to take to conduct this dive, and got the gear and stuff. And so on the morning of 9/11, we were flying, me and 3 armed FBI agents were flying from Newark Airport to Chicago and connecting in Chicago to Traverse City, a smaller flight to Traverse City, Michigan. And that was half the team. The other 4 were going to take a later flight in the afternoon. And then on Wednesday, the 12th, we were going to start diving. And sure enough, I get on United Flight 91, which was the sister flight of United 93, and we take off. And as we're lifting off northbound out of Newark Airport, I look over, as everybody does, if they're seated on a window seat on the east side of the plane, looks at Lower Manhattan because it's such a lovely view. And everybody says the same thing. That morning was a very clear, bright, early fall day.
It was a gorgeous day. Just
a gorgeous morning. And you look at that New York skyline, and then I saw the first plane hit the North Tower. I didn't know what to think of it at first. I looked back to my about 4 rows behind me, also on the window seat, was one of my divers, and we just shrugged at each other and looked. And then we banked west, as you do when you're climbing out of Newark, and I lost sight of the city. And it wasn't long after the co-pilot came out into the cabin and called me, the other 3 agents, to the back alley, because they all, when we were all flying armed, the pilot, co-pilot, and the crew all knows all of our seat numbers and where we're sitting. And we know everybody else. So I knew my 3 guys because we got on the plane together. Had there been other armed agents, had a DEA agent been flying to Chicago on that flight that day, they would have told us, hey, 6E or 14D, there's another one of your friends. They usually write it on a napkin and give it to us. And you just put your eyes on the guys so you know their face. I mean, I knew my 3 guys, obviously. But that morning, there was nobody else armed on the flight except us. And I always asked if there was any guns in the cockpit. There weren't. And so she got us, it was a female co-pilot. She got us back in the back alley. And that was like every other plane that morning was only a quarter full. It was a Tuesday morning, a very low. So the last maybe 10 or 15 rows, I remember there wasn't anybody sitting in. It was a 757. And she told us there's been an attack in New York, that planes are being hijacked all over the country. Remember, this is I'm saying this is probably 30, 40, 50 minutes into it. So the misinformation is, she told us there are 20, 25 planes that aren't accounted for, most of them not responding to radio traffic or whatever. So you're like, oh my God, the entire Eastern Seaboard is under attack. This is Red Dawn. This is whatever. So I put 2 of my guys outside the cockpit door, and I went into the cockpit to talk to the captain with the co-pilot. And I could hear him trying to call out to United 93. And these 2, United 93 was also a 757, I believe. It was going from Newark to San Francisco. So it was fully loaded with fuel. We were going Newark to Chicago, so we were about half the fuel. But that morning in the United Pilots Lounge, all those pilots get together that morning. Hey, what route are you taking? What's the weather like? Because they have to discuss weather and stuff. So we literally went back behind them in the flight path, but they weren't responding to their radio. And so I was talking to the co-pilot and hearing the pilot do his thing, trying to call 93. And I said, where are they? And she says, we don't know where they are. They've shut their transponder off. And I said, the transponder is the device that tells air traffic control where they are and tracks them. I said, why would they do that? And the pilot kind of snapped back, and he was listening with one ear to our conversation, and he said they wouldn't. And he went back, and it was a curt response, and I was taken aback a little bit. I looked at her, at the co-pilot. I said, I motioned to her. I said, what does that mean? I said, you're telling me they shut it off, and he's saying they wouldn't. And at that point, I could see she was welling up a little bit. And she said, that means they're not flying the aircraft. That, if you know the history of hijacking in America in the 60s and 70s, when we had all those political hijackings, take me to Cuba, take me to Angola, all those hijackings, the pilots are always told, just take them where they want to go. Put the plane down, get everybody on the ground, and we'll negotiate your release. Don't do anything in the air. That's where the most danger is. Just do what they say. Wherever they want to go, go. Do not give up control of the aircraft under any circumstances. The acknowledgement that they weren't flying the aircraft meant those pilots knew that their coworkers were probably dead in that aircraft because they wouldn't have given up control of that aircraft. They just wouldn't. And that was standard operating procedure by pilots. And that grew out of the political hijackings. We just never had the occasion where planes were literally hijacked to be used as weapons. The hijackings were always using planes as a vehicle, as a transportation device to get to a place, not as a weapon itself. This was the first time that this occurred. And so that's why when she said that they weren't flying the aircraft, she pretty much knew that her coworkers, who she probably had coffee with an hour earlier, were probably dead. So we didn't get near Chicago. They diverted us, and because Chicago was another one, the Sears Tower, and everybody thought maybe nobody knew what to think. So we landed in Detroit. They put us down in Detroit, and it was pandemonium in the airport in Detroit. We were lucky because Attorney General Ashcroft was supposed to be in Detroit that day, and his advanced security team. The FBI, by the way, is the one who guards the Attorney General. Right. So his security detail is the FBI. So we had a advanced security team. He had never left DC that morning. He was scheduled to, but he didn't for obvious reasons. But his advanced team was there with two 15-passenger vans, and there were only like 8 of them. So they were driving one van back, and they were going to turn the other one in. And I said, please, just can you bring it to the airport where we need to drive back to New York? And so they met us at the airport, gave us their 15-passenger van, and 4 of us drove from Detroit back to New York, actually Newark Airport, to get our vehicles. We had left them in long-term parking that morning. And then we all drove into the city and got to ground zero. It was already dark, and the big lights were already set up. And I got the lay of the land. I got the download on what was happening and we knew that John O'Neill, I call him our SAC, he had literally retired a week or 2 prior, was still missing. Lenny Hatton obviously was still missing. A couple of other agents who were unaccounted for, but they weren't sure whether they were out of town and just weren't known or whatever. But we had maybe at that point, by the time I got back, it started with 30 agents missing, 10 agents missing, 5 agents missing. And then by the time, after a couple of days, we knew everybody was accounted for except for John and Lenny. And Lenny was the only one that was an active FBI agent still missing. We never found Lenny. We never found any piece of him or part of him. John we found. John O'Neill's body was found a couple of days later. He was literally in the lobby with some of our people, and he said, I'm going back up to my office, which was on the 40th floor of the South Tower. And that was the last time we had heard of it from him. But yeah, so we lost. Most agents will tell you, very especially New York agents, will tell you that we lost 2 agents that day, even though officially John had retired. But John was the Al-Qaeda guy. John was the guy hunting bin Laden for decades. And he was the guy, ironically, that they got in that attack. But John was the guy. John was our counterterrorism guy. Was an incredible agent, incredible man, had his human frailties like all of us. But as far as work goes, and as far as anybody more knowledgeable than him on Al-Qaeda, there isn't anybody. There wasn't anybody at the CIA or the Pentagon that was more knowledgeable about Al-Qaeda and its operations than John O'Neill. And he had built an incredible team around him on the counterterrorism side. I-49, I-44, all those guys on the Joint Terrorism Task Force were just incredible people. They had stopped several large terrorism attacks before 9/11. They got a bad rap, 9/11. I'm working on a project now that's going to tell the real story about that investigation, about what happened. And hopefully it'll shed new light on the heroes of that time.
Can you say whether this will be a television series or a book or a film, or what can you say about it?
It's actually going to start as an Audible project. So it's called After the Fall, and it's about the largest investigation in really law enforcement history. When you look at the manpower and the years that were taken, it was the largest investigation, and it's called After the Fall. It'll be an Audible series that we hope to turn into an unscripted and maybe even then a scripted series. But After the Fall will be out sometime on Audible, and we interviewed, over 30 agents that were directly involved in the investigation, and including the head of the overall investigation, Mary Galligan. She was a friend of mine and an incredible agent. And ironically enough, she was in Oklahoma City on 9/11 doing a kind of a review for the FBI of the Oklahoma City bombing investigation on 9/11. And the military literally got her a C-130, and she flew back to Stewart Air Force Base in New York on a C-130 just for her, and one other agent I think was with her. But she was literally in Oklahoma City for a few days prior to 9/11 doing a review of the FBI's Oklahoma City investigation. So she is incredible, and the team she put together to work this was incredible. They moved them down to DC, and those people worked nonstop. And so we have their stories, and a lot of them were working Al-Qaeda for years prior, and they were at the East Africa embassy bombings, and they were at the USS Cole, and they knew these guys, and they knew something was coming. And you'll hear them, and they're open. And that's what our project is about: listening to the people that were there. These are the actual voices of the people that were actually doing the work, and we have an unprecedented number of them giving us their take and what happened behind the scenes. Most of them, thankfully, are retired now, because next year is the 20th anniversary, obviously. Most of them had 4, 5, 6, 8 years already in the FBI, and now most of them are retired. I think we only had 2 or 3 out of 30 plus people that were still with the FBI. And we cover everything from, obviously, the Operation Ground Zero, the morgue, the Fresh Kills landfill, Shanksville, people that were on the ground in Shanksville, people that were on the ground at the Pentagon. So you'll hear from all of them in this project and all their own voices.
And this is in conjunction with the folks at XG, correct?
Yes, this is an XG Productions project. Yes, that very definitely. And I was asked to lead it and I'm writing it because I was there, and most of these people are friends of mine. Were friends of mine then, and they're still friends of mine now. So most of them probably wouldn't have done it. In fact, some said they wouldn't have done it, except for the request came from me. So that was a very big honor for me to hear them say that. And many of them, this is the first time they're talking about any of this stuff. Several of them were interviewed at the 9/11 Commission. They were interviewed behind screens and their names were altered in the report, but you'll hear them tell you who they are in the report. I was known as Johnny or whatever, and you'll hear them tell you who they were in the 9/11 report and stuff, because with the passage of time, they're able to talk about a lot of these things now. Some of them not. Some of them still classified, but much of it is not anymore.
This sounds amazing. So this is going to be after the fall. It's going to debut as an Audible book.
An Audible series, so you'll hear it. You'll be able to, the Audible services. It used to be called, I hate that. It's not a podcast and it's not an audio book. It's an Audible series, if you will.
Right,
like an Audible documentary, if you will.
And do we know what month it's going to be out yet?
No, not yet. We're still in the editing phase and I'm still writing the episodes right now. It's a little different when you're writing one of these things because now we have transcripts that are 40, 60, 80 pages of people talking, and I have to match their voices and have a narrative thread and then put 2 or 3 voices together of different people. And hopefully they're saying similar things and it's making sense as a story. Because it's not just one person blaring on. It's your point and then her point and then his point and then that. And everything kind of tells a story in a narrative thread. But it's not really writing. It's more like cutting and pasting. But so we do that and then we get a rough cut of the audio. Because even though the words on the paper might sound like they go together, the tonal differences might be too much. It's a very intricate process putting one of these Audible things together. It's a tremendous amount of work.
Join us again next time on Mind Over Murder as we continue our conversation with retired FBI agent Bobby Chacon.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.